Welcome to the Isle of Man, a tiny island in the Irish Sea. It's not quite part of the UK, but it has its own 1,000-year-old parliament. The king is head of state, but doesn't quite rule. This is the Isle of Man. Join me as we also uncover a language that technically died, then came back, the most dangerous race on earth, and a Viking kingdom that never lived. The Isle of Man isn't in the United Kingdom. It isn't independent either. And it's not part of the European Union. Yet this small island in the Irish Sea has its own parliament, its own laws, its own courts, its own stamps, its own currency, and even its own language. These guys basically do what they want when they want. It governs itself, but the king is its head of state. It uses British money, but British law doesn't apply. Officially, the Isle of Man is something called a crown dependency, which is a polite way of saying it doesn't fit into any normal category. And to understand why this place exists in this strange political grey zone, we need to go back over 1,000 years. Did you know parts of the Isle of Man have no national speed limit? On some roads, drivers can legally go as fast as they want. One of the last places in Europe where that's still allowed. Long before Magna Carta, long before the English Parliament even existed, the Isle of Man was already governing itself. These guys were the first to the party. They set the pace. In the year 979 AD, Viking settlers established Tynwald, a parliament so old it's still recognized today as the oldest continuous parliament on earth. And unlike most parliaments, Tynwald doesn't just meet in grand buildings. Once a year, it gathers outdoors on an ancient mound called Tynwald Hill, exactly where it met over 1,000 years ago. Here's the rule that makes it truly unique. For a law to be valid, it must be read aloud in two languages, English and Manx. If it isn't spoken, it doesn't count. More like saying things twice, just to make sure we're on the same page here. While England's parliament evolved through conquest, civil war, and revolution, the Isle of Man simply kept meeting. Every year, since 979, governments rose and fell around it, but Tynwald never stopped. Most people think Vikings. They imagine raids, burning villages, and kingdoms that vanished as quickly as they appeared. In other words, a very barbaric people behaving in a very barbaric way. But on the Isle of Man, Vikings didn't just raid. They settled, they ruled, and in many ways, they never left. For centuries, the island was a Norse kingdom, longer than Viking rule lasted in most of Britain. And instead of erasing what came before, Norse culture fused with Celtic tradition, creating something entirely new, Manx identity. Even today, that Viking influence survives in the island's laws, its land ownership system, and in the very structure of its government. Look at the Manx symbol, 3 armored legs chasing one another in a circle. The Triskelion, likely inspired by Norse symbolism, and beneath it, the island's motto, whithersoever you throw it, it will stand. A Viking island, shaped by conquest, but defined by survival. Interesting point. The Isle of Man prints its own money. Manx pounds look like British pounds, but you can't spend them in the UK. For centuries, the people of the Isle of Man spoke Manx, a Celtic language older than English on the island itself. But as the modern world crept in, Manx began to disappear. English took over schools, government, and daily life. Then in 1974, the last native speaker of Manx died.
Bheith mí rugadh trogad as an Allen seo, ná mí ruadh bheith back from Spaldby.
Linguists declared the language extinct. UNESCO added it to the list. And that should have been the end. But it wasn't. Parents began teaching Manx to their children. Schools brought it back into their classrooms. Street signs, ceremonies, and public life followed. Today, children on the Isle of Man grew up bilingual, speaking a language that was once written off as dead. Like a zombie apocalypse, the Manx language rose from the dead, and now it's undeadly cool. The Isle of Man is one of the only places on earth where a dead language came back. Not in museums, but in playgrounds. Every summer, something extraordinary happens on the Isle of Man. Quiet villages close their roads. Stone walls become barriers, and ordinary streets transform into a racetrack. This is the Isle of Man TT. The roads are narrow, the speeds are wild, and bravery is Spartan level. And easily the most dangerous. Riders reach speeds of 300 kilometers an hour, flying past lampposts, houses, and dry stone walls, on roads that just days earlier locals were using to go to work. To the outside world, it looks insane. But on the Isle of Man, the TT isn't just a race, it's a ritual. Families open their homes, villages become grandstands. The entire island moves to the rhythm of the race. In most countries, this event will be illegal. Did you know there are no snakes on the Isle of Man? Local legend says St. Patrick drove them out, but in reality, they simply never made it across the sea. The Isle of Man doesn't just survive on tourism alone. For decades, it's quietly built another reputation as a global center for finance, online gaming, and digital businesses, low taxes, flexible regulation, and political stability in an unpredictable world. Critics call it a tax haven. Supporters call it a regulated gray zone, not offshore secrecy, but strategic autonomy. As they say on the island, we are not hiding money. We are just parking it nicely. This is why banks, gaming companies, and even crypto firms came here. And it's why the European Union watches the island closely. For a place this small, financial independence isn't optional. It's survival. Without it, the Isle of Man will be forced to rely on the UK and risk losing the very autonomy it's protected for over 1,000 years. For the Isle of Man, finance isn't greed, it's insulation. So, what exactly is the Isle of Man? It isn't British, it isn't independent, and it isn't a tax haven in the usual sense. It's something far rarer, a political fossil, still alive. While empires rose and collapsed around it, the Isle of Man adapted. It kept its parliament when others lost theirs. It absorbed Viking rule without losing itself. It let its language die, then brought it back. And when survival demanded it, it built an economy designed to stay out of everyone's shadow. The Isle of Man is proof that small places don't survive by resisting power, but by navigating it. by bending without breaking, by standing no matter where history throws them. Whithersoever you throw it, it will stand. Final question. If the Isle of Man were created today, would it even be allowed to exist?